Mesdames et messieurs, chers acteurs de l'industrie du cajou, bonjour. Aujourd'hui, 3 juin 2026, l'Alliance pour le cajou africain passe le cap de sa 100e édition des webinaires qu'elle organise sur le marché global du cajou. Cet événement, d'une portée mondiale, a été d'une grande utilité pour les acteurs et actrices, en ce sens qu'il a permis à ces derniers de disposer d'informations utiles pour opérer des changements dans leur quotidien en termes d'activité sur l'industrie du cajou. Au nom du Conseil international consultatif du cajou, je voudrais remercier et féliciter tous les initiateurs, notamment l'Alliance pour le cajou africain et tous ses partenaires, sans oublier son consultant principal, Jim Patrice, et tous les consultants engagés dans ce processus pour permettre que l'événement soit une réalité. Bon vent à l'événement. Je vous remercie pour votre attention.
The African Cashew Alliance Global Market Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick provides quick and accurate information on the cashew markets. It is one of its kind. I haven't seen any other like this. It has deepened my understanding of the cashew sector by providing timely insights on cashew market trends, policy updates and analysis, and global market dynamics, as well as impact on policy. The webinars accelerate learning. They have influenced my perception and perspective. These webinars are invaluable for navigating the global cashew market and for competitive cashew business. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Africa Cashew Alliance. And long live the global market encounters. Thank you.
Yes, my name is Wim Simons from Away for Africa, also in cashew since 2008. You are asking me for a testimony on the ACA global markets with Jim Fitzpatrick. Yes, sometimes I follow, sometimes I hear also reactions from others. I think the main point is that transparency and understanding the relations, the mechanisms in the market. How do you analyze the volumes, the prices, the circumstances, the political ones, also the financial markets? How does the price parity between raw nuts and kernels also relate over time? It gives a lot of, let's say, insights. And that transparency is helping a lot, I think, to create more balance in the global cashew market. So I'm happy also that these global market outlooks are frequently there. Yes, I hope that they will continue.
Mesdames et messieurs, chers acteurs de l'industrie du cajou, bonjour. Aujourd'hui, 3 juin 2026, l'Alliance pour le cajou africain passe le cap de sa 100e édition des webinaires qu'elle organise sur le marché global du cajou. Cet événement, d'une portée mondiale, a été d'une grande utilité pour les acteurs et actrices, en ce sens qu'il a permis à ces derniers de disposer d'informations utiles pour opérer des changements dans leur quotidien en termes d'activité sur l'industrie du cajou. Au nom du Conseil international consultatif du cajou, je voudrais remercier et féliciter tous les initiateurs, notamment l'Alliance pour le cajou africain et tous ses partenaires, sans oublier son consultant principal, Fitzpatrick, et tous les consultants engagés dans ce processus pour permettre que l'événement soit une réalité. Bon vent à l'événement. Je vous remercie pour votre attention.
The African Cashew Alliance Global Markets Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick provides quick and accurate information on the cashew markets. It is one of its kind. I haven't seen any other like this. It has deepened my understanding of the cashew sector by providing timely insights on cashew market trends, policy updates and analysis, and global market dynamics, as well as impact on policy. The webinars accelerate learning. They have influenced my perception and perspective. These webinars are invaluable for navigating the global cashew market and for competitive cashew business. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Africa Cashew Alliance, and long live the global market encounters. Thank you.
Yes, my name is Wim Simons from Away for Africa, also in Cashew since 2008. You are asking me for a testimony on the Asia global markets with Jim Fitzpatrick. Yes, sometimes I follow, sometimes I hear also reactions from others. I think the main point is that transparency and
Hello, good morning. Good afternoon session. It's Patrick. Indeed, its inception in 2020. Thank you to those who have sent us your support. To mark this important and special edition of this webinar, we want to think about and discuss the future of the global cashew industry. Can we future-proof the cashew sector? Be part of this discussion. Share your comments and questions in the Q&A box. As always, this session is available in both French and English. You can select your preferred language by clicking on the group icon on the bottom of your screen, and then you mute the original sound. We are also streaming live on our Cashew Alliance with the kind support of the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, the GIZ MoveCom Cashew projects, who have indeed been with us since the inception of this webinar, the Cashew Club through the support of and the Sustainable Nuts Initiative. We invite you to the 2026 ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo, which will take place in Accra, Ghana, from the 15th to the 18th of September 2026. Join hundreds of cashew stakeholders to network, share experiences, and discuss the future of the cashew industry. Online registration is now ongoing, and you can visit www.africancashewaLliance.com to secure your spot now. And now to lead us in today's session is our regular hosts who have been with us and been doing this with us since the introduction of the webinar in 2020. Good morning, Jim.
Good morning, Isaac. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you too?
Well, I'm all right. I mean, 100 of these things, you start to get a bit tired. But let's talk about the markets. We're going to?
Yep.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our 100th edition. Not bad. Didn't expect that when we started. Today, we're going to start off in the usual way. We'll talk a little bit about the markets, and I'm going to update you on our opinions on the markets at the moment. Not too much of that. And then we look at this cashews at the crossroads, as I've called it. And what we're doing here is we're looking at some of the themes, some of the aspects that have arisen over the last 99 editions, some of the things that people are talking about, some of the things that people are not talking about, and maybe that's even more important, to try and get an insight on the future trends in this rather difficult to read business. And can we future-proof the cashew industry from some of the difficulties on the horizon? And I said, there's another question, isn't there? Do we want to future-proof the cashew industry? Do we want to actually intervene? Should we be intervening? Should there be as many policies and regulations as have been introduced over the past 5 years or so? It's okay, let's get into some of those questions. Let's have a look first of all at the market. And this is how we're seeing it over the past couple of weeks. Crop estimates have steadied. We're talking mainly in Africa now because that's where most of the news is. West Africa, we're well into the season, of course, coming to the end of the season in many areas. Crop estimates have steadied up a little bit. This is not what was talked about in February. By any means, there is no sign of a crop disaster, certainly in terms of the volume. The crops in Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, and Guinea are well underway and look quite optimistic. More of that in a few minutes. Farm gate prices across Africa, a little bit mixed at the moment. So they're falling in areas where quality is falling, but good quality raw nuts still in demand. Prices on those holding up, but it is very mixed picture, mainly due to quality, but also due to cash flow or lack thereof, and to a certain extent, a slow buying process from many processors, particularly in Vietnam. Looking at RCN prices, though, they seem to have maintained their levels against most expectations. You might say there's a touch of weakness in the market over the past week, but not much. And this illustrates the power of the players in the cashew market, particularly in the RCN market. So right now, looking at this, we see relatively steady RCN prices, farm gate prices under pressure in some areas, but cashew kernels prices have drifted down over the last 10 days or so, mostly on more offers from Vietnam. Mostly, I think it's fair to say, at the lower end of the spectrum in terms of quality, in terms of certification and reputation of the processors. So it kind of stands to reason that if you're weaker, you'll start to push out a little bit more. If the big guys follow, then the market could fall some more. Large nuts, though, remain a bright point. Large nuts still in demand. If you got 160s, 180s, you could sell them. China's buying those. Not buying much else, but it is buying those. Good news for Cambodia. Good news for processors in Vietnam or in Cambodia who have those nuts. They are large and they're good quality. And right now they're in demand. And there is a little bit of a knock-on effect on that as well. There's also some good demand for slightly lower grades, 240s particularly, as some buyers just move down a grade in order to protect themselves or to take advantage of some lower prices for 240s. If you ask me, I think that probably the big nuts are a little bit overpriced right now. 240s probably a little bit underpriced. The demand generally, though, the news is less optimistic. Generally speaking, demand is under pressure. The buoyant demand that we saw from many markets in 2025 just isn't there this year. That's not altogether surprising. And I don't mean that demand is going down. What I mean is it's not really growing at the moment. There are some areas of reasonable growth. The US imports up 5.5%, EU imports up a little, but not anything like what might have been expected as we came to the end of 2025. On the other side, we'll have a look at India and China, and there the situation is less optimistic. So the impact of the war continues, and this mismatch between kernels prices and RCN prices, kernels prices easing a little bit, RCN relatively steady, and particularly steady if you take into account that the lower quality that's available this year, and this is having an impact, especially for processors in Vietnam. Has an impact everywhere, but especially in Vietnam right now. So the market, slightly different tone than 2 weeks ago. It does, generally speaking, look a little bit weaker. The season, the harvest season this year is a little bit longer, so we're going to have a look at the supply situation. Normally, as we get into June, we know where supply is, but this year it is a little bit late, so we'll just update on that before we go any further. Cambodia, it looks like another good crop in Cambodia. Exports by the end of April. I don't have the export figures by the end of April, but by the end of May. But the export figures at the end of April up 25%. That's positive. Last year's crop was a little bit late, so maybe that'll even out a little bit. Looks to me as if 1 million tons, again, last year it was just over 1 million. Looks as if 1 million tons is certainly on the cards for 2026. They really do a good job in Cambodia in February and March of throwing so much doubt around as to the future of that harvest. Worked again this year. Almost everything for export is sold. They don't carry much in Cambodia. They don't have the infrastructure to do so. It goes to Vietnam. And maybe from next year, we'll see a little bit more processing in Cambodia. What about Vietnam itself? Well, imports up to the middle of May, the latest figures that we have from Vietnam Customs, 1.37 million. This is a big number. Although the first half of May was about the same as the first half of May last year, if we look at the first 4.5 months of the year, imports up by 17%. And that, that's a big figure, 17% of a figure of 1.37 million. This is a big increase. It means much more inventory in Vietnam. Exports are not reflecting that. And it is, you would really start to look at the level of stock, and we will do that in a minute. India, still a forecast for a decent crop overall. Naturally, India's a huge country. The harvested area is absolutely enormous. You will see reports in various places of good weather, bad weather, rains, too dry. You'll see everything. Generally, when we look at it, we think that the crop still looks pretty good this year. Imports, January to March, latest figures, official figures, 256,000 tons. That's very healthy compared to previous years too. I think we're seeing in Vietnam and India the impact of bigger production in East Africa, especially in Tanzania. So in India, it looks like we have full warehouses. We have a relatively weak rupee, and demand for the time being is a little bit quiet, let's say. India, like China, is suffering from the impact of higher energy prices, the restrictions on trade caused by the war on Iran, and we are seeing some of the impact of that in the domestic market. It probably means that the buying of raw cashew nuts will be a little bit slower. But on the other hand, for both India and Vietnam, if you want to buy raw cashew nuts in Africa, You've got to buy them quite early because literally there is nowhere to store them. So if you buy them now, you might get 46, 47. If you buy them in August, you might get 38, 40. So the trade will continue. Let's have a look at Vietnam, just at some of the numbers in Vietnam. I've mentioned the very healthy import figure, first half of May. If we look on the other side at exports, down by 1% by the 15th of May. 1% is neither here nor there, of course. But if we take exports, imports, the crop, the carry-in, an estimation of what's afloat, and perhaps I'm a little bit light on that afloat figure, that could easily be double that, it would say there's about 4 months of stock physical. That's in the country, in the warehouses, or on ships on the way. That's about the same as last year, a little bit more. It does tighten up as the year goes on, but because imports are so far ahead of previous years, I don't think that's going to happen this year. So adequate supplies. Processors, though, puzzled by the prices they're being asked for raw cashew nuts. They can't make that work with kernels, and that's difficult because do you sell or do you buy? Do you reduce your processing capacity? If you're big, you need to run material through that plant. The difference, if you have a 20,000 ton plant and you only process 15,000 tons, it's pretty likely that you're going to head for losses that year. You just don't have the volume to spread your fixed costs over. So it's going to be interesting to see how Vietnamese processors react. And I think in this, there is maybe a clue to the future. Maybe Vietnamese processors don't continue to grow the way they've been growing. They kind of just do it better in the future. We'll see how that goes. Over to Africa, moving west and looking at Nigeria first of all. So Nigeria is increasingly an important producer of cashews, 5.5% of the world cashews in 2025. Strong growth, 11% growth rate in Nigeria. So on that basis, we should expect increased production in the coming years. This year, we're thinking around about 300,000 tons or just below for the crop. It's a tough one because don't forget, you've got a lot of raw material flowing in from Benin. You have a fragmented production. You have it's an open market. So in the early stages, it's difficult to get a good handle on exactly what's happening in the market. Farm gates finished. Aggregators are holding, hoping for better prices. It's also a great currency hedge, of course. Prices at the farm gate are steady. And interestingly, now we're starting to see a renewal of the policy and regulatory discussions led by the Nigerian Cashew Association. And this looks to me as if we might see some regulatory changes in the not too distant future, certainly for the coming season. It'll be interesting to see how that goes now that the conflict in the Cashew Association has settled down. What about Ghana? Harvest's over. Officials still think it's 250,000 tons. Traders still think it's 150,000 tons. Me, I'm with the traders on this one. Low procurement by processors. I'm reading stuff on social media telling me how strong the Ghanaian cashew processing sector is. Do not believe that. Processors in Ghana are under real pressure. Most of them, even the biggest, have reduced their procurement this year. They struggle with lower quality, higher farm gate prices. This is a tricky one. Ghana is probably one of the best opportunities to invest in processing, but probably one of the most difficult places to set your supply chain in place so that you're guaranteed to get the right quality at the right time of year. Difficult time. I think there are some difficult days ahead for Ghana, just looking to the future in the cashew sector. In Benin, well, okay, so what do we say about Benin? It's the only country in the world of the major producers that has an export ban on raw cashew nuts. Hasn't impacted processing in the way it might have. It looks like this year processors have bought about 70,000 tons. That's about 40% of the crop. Not bad compared to other countries, but it's only about 50% of the processing capacity in the country. The crop, We think it's between 170 and 180,000 tonnes. The ministries will tell you a little bit higher than that. If we're right, if the trade is right, it's about 10-12% down on last year. Where does it go? Well, if 70,000 tonnes goes to processors, the rest goes illegally across the border for export. And I guess I was amused yesterday to see an Indian warehouse keeper, I think in Tuticorin, advertising Benin raw cashew nuts online, which are, of course, illegal from a Benin point of view. Let's move over to the big one, Côte d'Ivoire. Share of world production, 26%. This is growing quickly too, 9% compound annual growth rate over 10 years. Season's slowing, but the season has gone on a little bit longer than expected. Many people thought after the first crop that we had something of a crop disaster on our hands. We don't. The CCRK is telling us that about 1.25 million tonnes has already been commercialized. That means it's been bought by processors, exporters, or traders. The processors, they tell us, have bought around about 700,000 tonnes. I think it's a real stretch to think that 700,000 tonnes will be processed this year. So some of that material will come back for export, I think. Some of it is the better quality material because it was purchased early. It was purchased during the ban on exports, the first 2 months of the year. How that reconciles, how that policy reconciles with the idea of supporting processing is difficult to see. So many processors are also major exporters and traders of raw cashew nuts. I think more transparency is needed in that sector. But right now, farm gate prices are under real pressure. It's mainly based on quality. It's not unusual as we get to this time of year. Prices are as low as 250 CFA. Now that's 250 compared to the minimum farm gate price of 400. That's a real problem. So when we look at this overall situation, we see a sector finishing the year with a much better crop than might have been expected back in February or early March. We see some old crop come back to market as expected. We see some smuggling. That's export mainly to Ghana for movement to the ports. I think if we add it up, we're probably looking at a crop 1.35 to 1.4 million tonnes. That's compared to last year's crop of about 1.55 million tonnes, which was the record. If we're right, and the CCA estimate is now 1.3 million tonnes, 1.3 to 1.35. If we're right, if they're right, it's the second largest crop in history. So much for the early panic on Côte d'Ivoire. But we should recognize the quality is lower than last year. It's much more like 2023. It's not altogether unusual, but it is going to place a strain on processors' cost. Lower quality means your cost of processing is higher. Lower quality means your outturn of the higher value grades is reduced. Burkina Faso, the neighbor to the north, exports are now open. They've been open for a couple of weeks. The rule of supplying 10% of export to processors is still in place. Again, we have this mismatch between the official estimates and the trade estimates. So our estimates are based on asking processors, how much raw material have you received this year compared to last year? We ask traders, same question. We then look at the weather conditions and we come to a conclusion. Then we look at the current statistics on export and the current statistics on import at the other end. And we come to about somewhere between 160 and 180,000 tonnes. Definitely processing in Burkina is under pressure. It's been a really difficult season, high farm gate prices. Good news for farmers. Processors' expectations were of lower prices. They're going to struggle with that. They shouldn't really, because they should have their costs under control. They should have their marketing right to get prices that justify the farm gate price. But they don't. So right now, processors under pressure, probably some support required there. Let's go further west. Let's go right out west to the last country of the cashew harvest cycle, Senegal. Small producer. Looks like crop is a little bit down. This estimate I'm less confident of than the others because we're much earlier in the season. And what we hear, we're just saying somewhere between 10 and 13% down on production. It matters for Senegal, of course. In the big picture, it's not hugely impactful. Senegal remains a relatively small producer. There will be some material flowing in from Guinea-Bissau, but probably far less this year as the government in Guinea-Bissau has deployed more efficient measures to control that border trade. And moving to Guinea-Bissau, so it is an important source of particularly raw cashew nuts. Good quality material, and it started well this year. We're looking at, they tell me, 52 pounds. That's a pretty good quality. Typical, but nonetheless pretty good. They tell us that about 100,000 tons has been reported as commercialized. That means it's traded and is in the process of moving through the export market. Processing in Guinea-Bissau remains very small. Some of this information is from the African Cashew Alliance reporters, who are also responsible for the reports in the AfriCashew Splits, the market magazine of the African Cashew Alliance. Thanks to them for their information. Keep it up, guys. It's going well. We have Guinea as our final one to talk about, and here we see an estimate around about 150,000 tons. This is a lower crop. This is a lower quality crop and a slightly lower crop than was expected. But it does seem as if production in Guinea is beginning to settle down around about this level. Earlier it was difficult because there was a flow of product coming in on the border between Côte d'Ivoire and Guinea. That's largely been stemmed. So around 150,000 tons seems to be the number. There's also material flows in from Guinea-Bissau on the northern border, but it's not huge volumes. Quality is improving now. Some people are saying that one of the reasons for the poor earlier quality was that farmers were in a hurry to move product on. So they had a slightly later crop. They wanted to get some money in. They didn't do the drying properly, hadn't got the time to do it. And therefore, some of the aggregators received a lower quality product. It's logical. We'll know as the weeks go on whether that's accurate. So overall, what we're seeing across West Africa is a fairly settled situation, more optimistic in the Western sub-region at the beginning of the crop than we'd heard in the East back in February and March. And I think this crop, overall volume-wise, looks good. So we've marked our estimates of the crop. If you're regular on this webinar, you'll know we do a low estimate and a high estimate. So the high estimate now isn't far off last year's crop. That's adding up all production all the way around the world with certain assumptions. This is production though, and just bear in mind that not all production makes it to market in cashews. So we are comparing like with like, but it doesn't mean, for example, that there's 5.9 million tons available to be bought and traded right now. Harvest continues. There will be more product harvested in Côte d'Ivoire and obviously in the Western regions too. There'll be more in India, not much more, but there will be more in India. So this could get a little bit bigger. Lower quality has a big impact. It really has. It has a major impact, obviously, on pricing, but it has a huge impact on processing too. So unit cost per ton, processed volume, staffing, finance, it impacts everything. And this is going to be a major feature. It'll be a major feature for those that bought early in Nigeria, Benin, Côte d'Ivoire, and a little bit less so for those that waited. So the big questions are being answered. Côte d'Ivoire looks like a big crop with lower quality, a bit like 2023. Sagabi and Guinea estimated to be average to good crop. And looking further forward, Tanzania is forecasting another very big crop from September. And the weather conditions suggest that's on. But more importantly, the distribution of inputs in Tanzania suggests that that is on. So I wouldn't be surprised by the time we come to the end of the year, that we're looking at something a little bit closer to the upper end of our current estimate. And production is growing quickly. I mean, if we look at 2026, adding up all these numbers, first of all, in terms of the share, so it's just below the 60% in African countries, 47% in West Africa. That's actually a little bit down because Cambodia's share is a bit bigger this year. Vietnam and Cambodia together, 23%, India, 13%. And if we look at the growth rates, and this is, as we look forward, we need to look at the current growth rates, and that's why I'm just highlighting this at this point. So what we see is West Africa growing just under 8% per annum. This is the 5-year, this is the most recent growth, and this is growth in production. So this would reflect trees that were, or the addition of trees that were planted in the last 7 or so years, as well as weather conditions, as well as management of the trees. So we see fast growth in West Africa, very fast growth in East Africa, and I think that will be maintained for the coming 5 years at least. India, Vietnam remain essentially no growth, even contraction to Vietnam, depending on the year you take. Cambodia continues to grow. It's actually continued to grow a little bit more quickly than we expected, with 9% now the average growth rate over 5 years. And that's mostly new trees coming online. You do get some volatility depending on the weather conditions. We've seen that, particularly 2 years ago. But it looks as if it's set to continue to grow for a while. These are mostly young trees. Add all of that together, and world growth is just under 8% based on a 5-year compound annual growth rate. And, you know, when you get to about 6 million tons and you start to get into the law of big numbers, 8% to 6 million, we're talking big additional production every year. Now, it's volatile with the weather and climate change, but that's the growth, and that's something we need to focus on, and we're going to talk about that shortly. What about demand? I see India, it's difficult to read in India, but what do we hear that makes us think that Indian demand is slow? We hear about cost of living increases. We hear about government appeals for people to be a little bit more careful. We hear about warehouses full of various products, not only cashew nuts, but other nuts too. These are all indicators that demand is slowing down. Is it surprising? Not really, given the impact of high oil prices, given the impact of the weaker Indian rupee. It's not at all surprising. Nor is it surprising that Chinese demand for cashews, or at least imports this year, has drifted a little bit. This is to do, I think, with the economic situation in China, weaker consumer spending generally, cashews being a relatively new product. Remember, last year was a big, big year for growth of cashew consumption in China. It's easy to lose that. Most observers in China expected that growth would slow this year. So it has. But they didn't expect that it would slow by so much, I think. And that's down to the impact of war and energy. UAE, look, it's very difficult to judge in the current conflict circumstances. Let's hope it ends soon. But definitely imports way down, 30% down January to April. And that's not going to be fixed till these people make a lasting peace agreement. European Union, imports are steady in volume. The growth is pretty flat. EU has been one of the star performers in cashew growth over the last decade. We are seeing that curve begin to flatten a little bit. That's still positive. It's something that you might expect after a longer period. Probably European economies are not as heavily impacted as either India or China, but there is nonetheless an impact, and that seems to be slowing demand. Retail prices in several supermarkets, especially discounters, have been reduced. Not sure what that'll do. It could increase demand. And of course, the consumption of snacks during the World Cup, the football event that's going to start, I think, next week, That sometimes boosts snack demand, but in all honesty, that should have already been seen at wholesale level. So I'm not sure exactly how much of an impact that's going to have this year. And finally, the United States performing much better this year than last year, 5.5% up in the first quarter. That's the US figures. If you look at Vietnam's export figures to the US, they are a little bit better than that. I decided to look at US customs figures this time. 5.5% up January to March. That's good, but it remains, the first quarter remains 10% below the average of 2020 to 24 first quarter. So you would start to wonder whether or not there is a genuine recovery in cashew demand on for the US this year. I suspect there isn't, and I wonder if we've seen some fundamental change in the pattern in the United States for cashew nuts. Have we seen a move toward domestic nuts? Is pistachio taking over the market? We know pistachio demand is buoyant. It'd be interesting to see, but I do not expect that we should rely on the United States for strong growth anytime in the near future. And that actually reflects the pattern of some years ago, where during the last decade, we saw relatively slow growth, around about 2% in US imports. The trend, by the way, toward more processed imports, which was a big trend up until the introduction of import tariffs, has been slowed. So now it looks as if the processed import is under a little bit of pressure, and people are reverting back to just importing natural kernels to be roasted and packed in the United States. So overall then, conclusions, 2026 harvest, I'm still not entirely sure, but it looks like it's between 2 and 6% lower than 2025. That makes it the second largest crop in history, but it also makes it one of the lower quality crops. And maybe that's a sign of things to come as well, given our theme for today. We have imports of raw cashew nuts, and inventories at destination are adequate for the time being. Calculated 4 months in Vietnam, something similar in India. Kernels, probably a little bit tighter, but then one of the impacts of sourcing in West Africa means that you have much shorter lead time to delivery of containers from cashew processors in countries like Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, or Ghana. Demand growth is slowing down, as we've just discussed, and buying, I think the sentiment in the market remains quite patient. Most buyers, they're not really suggesting that they expect prices to fall, but they're pretty patient in what they're doing, as far as I can see. We are entering a peak period for demand, certainly in Europe and North America, where June, July, they start to prepare for the peak winter festivals. In India, we will see the peak for Diwali, October, I believe. But the gate is beginning to close. So buyers have to make decisions on this. If they don't buy, it's gone. They won't buy. This demand, festival-based demand, is one-off. So if you don't buy now and you don't have the material in place, it's pretty difficult to restart that later in the year. So I think we are at a period when the demand for the year will be set. Now, my guess is that demand will be not as good as last year, but not bad either. But a big factor on the recovery of demand patterns is when the Straits of Hormuz open, oil prices fall, oil and gas prices fall, and that allows India particularly, but also China, everywhere really, to return to a more normal pattern, and we might then see some demand coming in. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's any, at least in my opinion, any chance of a major fall in cashew kernels prices, but it wouldn't be at all surprising if top processors, particularly in Vietnam, drift back from the 325, 330, back to the levels which you can get from mid-range and lower processors at the moment, 15 to 20 cents lower than that. I suppose as an adjunct to that, we should mention that in West Africa, most processors are still making good premium prices based on quality, based on various certifications, based on location, and simply based on the idea that many buyers want to diversify their supply chains. So we're still seeing that premium maintained. 335 to 345 for 320s from good processors at the moment. Could that be eroded? Yeah, it's possible that that premium would be a little bit eroded, but I think at the same time, with most people well sold, the chance for that happening are relatively low. So it's not the ideal situation coming into the month of June, but it is a situation which could be a lot worse, to be honest. I mean, demand-wise, demand is holding up despite the economic pressures. When will we know more? Really, probably we'll have to wait till August till we get a real read on demand. And of course, by then, it's pretty much too late to do anything about it for kernels for this year. But there will be a knock-on effect into next year. So let's take some of those factors into account, and particularly remembering the growth rates of production. I wanted to have a look at production and the future and the balance between supply and demand in the coming years. And ask the question really, is the cashew sector, our cashews, at a crossroads? And some might say they've passed the crossroads, but let's have a look. First of all, I'd like to take a look at production. And this is the current production trend. And so you can see enormous growth, 2008 all the way through, and then this growth spurt as Cambodia comes online. And it's a little bit volatile during the period 2019 through to 2022, 2023, but it's settled now somewhat. So we're seeing strong growth. If that continues, by 2030, production will be up around the 7 million tons. If you project that forward, by 2035, that's 8.2 million tons. And even official estimates, and I've mentioned throughout earlier discussion, official estimates tend to be overly optimistic. Some might say exaggerated, but big anyway. Official forecast would put production at 7.6 million tons by 2030. So this is a significant escalation in production trends. And generally, over the years, what we've seen is that once cashew trees are in the ground, they're left there. Very rare for trees to be cut down and production to fall for that reason. So this projection, of course, does not take into account year-to-year weather conditions. It does take into account, to a certain extent, some impact of climate change, more of that in a minute. And it does take into account tree age, more of that too. But if we look at it and just look for some kind of an indication, by 2035, if things continue as they have been, annual production globally would increase by more than the total imports of the European Union, the United States, and China put together last year. That's a huge increase. So these are respectively 1, 2, 3 importers in the world. And by 2030, we're going to increase, or by 2035, we're going to increase production by the total of all of their imports last year. That's a little bit worrying. So let's have a look at it. What would it mean? So what we've done here is we've taken, in the green bars, 2 forecasts of production, and the blue is the current demand trend based on 10-year growth rates. And when we do that, what we see is that a significant surplus emerging. We saw this beginning back with the big crop in 2025, but it was there previously, 2023, 2021, 2020. Don't forget, not all cashews that are grown make it to market, and these are production figures versus consumption figures. So the answer to some of this is, well, leave it lying. Don't buy it. Let it rot. Don't harvest it. That happens sometimes. But if we use 2025 as the baseline, that's the dark blue bars we end up with production in kernels terms. And so when we compare kernels with kernels. I use 21%, a relatively conservative outturned figure. We get just under 4 million tons of kernels. If we project using the average production of 2021 to 2025 as the baseline, production is somewhat lower. Why is that? Well, simply because if we use 2025, we're using the largest crop in history for our projection. So we also need to moderate that by looking at the average over previous years. So it seems that even by 2030, so here we are 2030, even a poor crop would still maintain a surplus. And by 2035, if demand were to continue to grow at its current rate, we end up with this increasing surplus. So we started with a relatively minor surplus that could easily be offset by a poor crop or a growth spurt in demand. In 2025, China had a growth spurt. The demand in China was spectacular. We saw that absorb most of the surplus. We're not seeing that this year, and that's why the market's on hold for now, as we've described. But if we project this forward, and of course this is hypothetical, let's be very clear. This is what if what's happened in the past happens in the future. And this is what would happen if what's happened in the past continued. We'd get this major surplus emerging. We have ended up going from a deficit supply situation back in 2016, 15, 16, 17, to a surplus situation in 6 years. So what happens when you get really high prices? Well, people plant cashews like there's no tomorrow, like they're going out of fashion, but they're actually coming into fashion. And what's happened is that over those 6 years, we've gone from a deficit situation to a production surplus situation. And we saw low prices up to May 2024 as a result of that. It's improved since, and it more or less reflects the value now. Production has grown where? Well, mainly in West Africa, mainly on new land to be planted. Some improvements in yield, but mostly extension, more trees on more land. In Cambodia, more trees on more land, but more trees of super varieties, super yielding varieties on more land. M23 and others are the varieties that have achieved this huge production miracle, and I don't use the word lightly. And now we're seeing in East Africa increased production. So the initial wave of increased production coincided with COVID, which meant not all material reached the market, and it coincided with a strong growth spurt in the market, particularly post-COVID in Europe, United States, and thereafter in China and in India. Can that continue? And that's the big question. But if we look at the numbers, if we look at production growing at a 10-year number, I saw earlier I showed you the 5-year number, 7.99. The 10-year equivalent number is 7.3%. So that means actually production has grown more quickly in the last 5 years than in the earlier 5 years. And that too is an indicator that this trend may well continue. But if we look at consumption, so what is consumption? The way I calculate consumption is it's all imports in all importing countries, plus Indian domestic consumption, a small amount of Vietnamese domestic consumption, but most cashew countries don't consume the cashews that they grow. Exceptions might be Indonesia to a certain extent, Nigeria to a lesser extent, and Vietnam to a very small extent. But we take that into account. India, different case, biggest consuming country in the world, about 33% of world consumption. So on these trends, we see that production is growing far more quickly than consumption, and that would lead to a growing surplus. Let's have a look at some of the factors that might mean that could change. Bearing in mind our theme today is, can we future-proof the cashew sector? And this imbalance between supply and demand is a key issue to answer that question. So if we look at consumption, so what are we looking at here? So we're looking at a chart of cashew consumption, the annual change, the annual growth or fall in cashew consumption over the period from 2010 to 2025. And that's based on the calculation, as I've just outlined, imports, India, domestic consumption in some countries. What impacts it? Price and price volatility. So if we look at price and price volatility, we see two key periods. We see the high prices of 2016 through to 2018 essentially killed demand growth during that period. We see low prices in 22, second half 2022, 2023, first 4 months of 2024, and that improved demand at that time. So price is a big factor, and those are two key areas where it influenced it. Other factors were at play at other times. So if we think about economic trends, we see a decline following the so-called Great Recession, 2009-10. We see a decline during COVID, not at all surprising, and we see a decline in 2023. That followed on from 2022, where we got a spike in energy prices following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and we saw key impacts on Europe, on the United States, and to a lesser extent on the major Asian economies. So economic trends have influenced it too. But also, and you'll see some spectacular periods of growth, and that I think is mostly down to consumer trends. So way back 2012, 2013, we saw the first wave, actually possibly the second wave, because back in 2004 we saw something similar. We saw a big growth in consumption and imports right around the world as first of all, there was a correction following low growth in 2010 and 2011, and then very positive trends on tree nuts, which buoyed cashews along. Somewhat similarly, post-COVID, we saw a surge in the consumption of tree nuts right around the world. Just about every country saw a significant growth and those kind of consumer trends. The other factors that impact, that I want to mention that impacts demand is demographics. So countries like India, which has a rising population and a more affluent population year on year, are going to consume more cashew nuts. It's kind of structural, but the rate of growth is not reflecting the rate of growth of production. That's my point in this discussion. The reaction time on demand is pretty fast. It's 12 to 18 months. So we see demand and consumption impacted by prices and price volatility, economic trends, consumer trends, and by demographics. But what about production, the other side of the coin? Production trends tend to be a little bit steadier and reaction is a little bit slower. So here again, we look at annual increase or decrease, the annual change in production. So how much did it change in 2025 from 2024 and so on back over the years, back as far in this case as 2010. And what we see is somewhat volatile. We see a increase and a decline. And we see 1, 2, 3, 4 declines, 1 year of very slow growth. But on average, we see growth right across the period. What impacts it? Well, it's a crop. So what impacts it is the weather. And taking a more longer term view is climate change. The availability of inputs and the cost of those inputs. So whether farmers use them. So sometimes that's impacted by what happened in the previous season. You might, as a farmer, treat your trees very well in a good year and not so well in a year where prices have been low and your income is much lower. The management of the trees, so this would involve good practices in the orchards, those have improved. Maybe not as much as we would like to have seen, but they certainly have improved. The available varieties, so take in West Africa, for example, most new trees are planted from seeds. People get the best seeds from local trees and plant them. In Cambodia, the miracle of Cambodian production was used M23, M10, and 1 or 2 other varieties to plant improved varieties where you now have slightly larger farms, you have much higher yields. I think the country average is about 1.5 tons, and you have a monoculture of cashews, which would be unusual in other countries, particularly in African countries. But we don't see really a huge impact of price, at least in short-term production. So yes, when prices are good, farmers will invest some of that money and plant more trees, but it has to be the culmination of all the factors. The inputs, the seedlings have to be available as well. So if we look at 16, 17, 18, these increases in production are not a result of high prices in 2016 or 17. These are more or less a correction from 1 year of very low growth. Reaction time is much slower. So if a tree were planted in 2018, it would give its first crop maybe 2021. It would come to maturity maybe in 2024, 2025. So you see growth in consumption much more slowly, and the impact hits the market much more slowly. That's direct contrast to demand, where you're looking at 12 to 18 months for an impact. That means that whatever is happening now in production is likely to continue. It doesn't mean that whatever is happening now in demand and consumption has to continue. But in production, it generally does, apart from variation according to the weather conditions. But this year, with relatively poor weather conditions in West Africa, we're still looking at a pretty decent sized crop. It may be lower quality, but it's nonetheless the second largest crop in history. What might change this on production? So someone said to me, Jim, all these trees are getting very old, so that's going to change it. So we did a little bit of an analysis. This builds on an interesting analysis we did last year, actually the end of the previous year, for the European Union German CapSafe project in Cambodia. And we analyzed, or we counted, and it was laborious, the age of trees. And what we see is that in those areas that are the biggest producers, West Africa, excluding Cote d'Ivoire, Cambodia, they also have the youngest trees. So we see only 12% of the trees in Cambodia are more than 20 years old. Only 20% in Cote d'Ivoire. So the growth that we've seen tends to continue, whereas if we look at much older trees, so for example in East Africa, and that's an interesting case now where trees are much older, should that start production to fall? Well, the evidence is no, because what we're seeing is older trees in Tanzania still seem to appear to give very good yields. In Mozambique, there's been a lot of projects to rehabilitate, replant, rebuild. Strategies like top working on trees has caused production to increase. So it does look as if the largest producers have the largest trees, the youngest trees, and that means that tree age is not going to be a factor. Will climate change be a factor? And this is pretty interesting stuff, I think, but of course I would. So more areas will become suitable than will be lost due to climate change in West Africa. So this is one of the initial conclusions of some research done for the Move Cashew project. And what it shows is, looking at the dark green areas, those are the areas that become suitable for production of cashews. They're mostly cocoa areas right now. And the orange areas are areas that might be lost. So what we're seeing is that by 2030 and beyond, more areas become suitable to grow cashews. So climate change, apart from year-to-year variation in rainfall and wind, climate change should create more areas for cashews. And if you drive around cocoa areas in Cote d'Ivoire or Ghana, you're starting to see cashew trees in amongst the cocoa. And that wouldn't have been seen 10 years ago. So will tree age or climate change impact this production trend? It seems unlikely. What about on the demand side? So we've said that production is growing, and there seems to be, at least over the next decade, very little that can change that trajectory. Farmers don't cut down cashew trees. If the price goes down, they just wait for the next year, they keep going. That's a typical smallholder tree crop growth. But what about on the consumption side? Is there anything that could accelerate consumption? So we take 5 major markets, or 4 major markets, plus Africa as a huge potential market. And if we look at it, so we see growth in Europe, including the EU plus, we see 5.3% growth over 5 years per annum. It's less this year. Growth is steady. The highest ever growth has been 11.42% in the 5-year period up to 2016. China 16%, India about 6.6%. Africa we don't know, but we know there's huge potential. And the United States has actually contracted over the last 5 years in terms of its imports. So if we think that consumption is growing in all of those countries, there's only one, and that's China, which shows over the last 5 years enough growth to absorb the increase in production. But China's only 14% of the world market. And China's imports are down 15% this year. So this 16% 5-year average is going to fall by the end of 2026 when we recalculate it. So we're not seeing at the moment in the current trends, despite strong trends in all sorts of things, in healthy snacking, healthy eating, sustainability, growing affluence, diversification of cuisine and health concerns, we're still not seeing enough growth to offset the growth in production. So we are seeing a very healthy growth in consumption, and we've seen that for many years. But we're not seeing enough to offset the growth in production. Could consumption accelerate to meet production growth? There's nothing here to say it could. We need to go back to the exceptional years, 2012, 2013, when growth did grow incredibly quickly, but it was a correction. It grows, consumption responds quickly to crises. It responds up or down to high prices. It responds to economic conditions. It responds also to low prices. If we look at the various crises over the years, we see that actually the trend is emerging now that consumption responds quickly to disruption, COVID-19, war in Ukraine, war in the Gulf, but it reacts actually a little bit more slowly. So reacting to crises is almost instant. Stop shipments, delay shipments, stop buying, cancel, defer, delay. But when we look at price volatility, it takes a lot longer to react. So we look at the record highs of 2015 through to the beginning of 2018, and we see decline, then price comes down, then a growth spurt to correct. So it actually reacts a little bit more slowly, 12 to 18 months to price volatility, but then it takes longer to recover. So we see long after the prices had crashed towards the end of 2017 into 2018, demand was still poor. So 15 months after the highs of the market had long gone, demand was still suffering from the consequences of the very high prices of that period, and that will continue. So there is room to believe that demand could respond, particularly to lower prices, but that would need all the current trends, healthy eating, snacking, etc., to continue, and it would need prices to moderate. And that's what happens in markets when oversupply. Prices moderate or they fall. And that's the danger, and that's a risk. So in conclusion, what we see for the future is production is growing quickly. The tree age, climate change, some of these arguments will not stop that production growth, at least for now, at least for the next 5 years and probably the next 10 years. Demand trends are not showing signs that they will catch up, so demand growth is not going to increase from just under 5% to just under 8%. That's no clue that might happen. And therefore, a production surplus is inevitable. And it has already emerged. Don't get the message that this means prices are going down tomorrow. It doesn't. It means that we have a structural problem over the longer period. Some realities in the market, if we look at it, every cashew country still promotes production increase. Every single country wants to increase its production, despite the fact that there's an emerging surplus. That the raw cashew nut trade and its infrastructure particularly is underpowered. What do I mean by that? I'll give you an example. Why does the quality of cashews decline in the course of the season in West African countries? Mainly because there's a lack of structure, a lack of infrastructure to manage that crop. It comes in, it lies, it's not dried properly, there's no warehouses to put it in, the jute bags aren't used, quality declines. We struggle with a international trade of 3.5 million tonnes. What if that were 5.5 million tonnes? Trading companies continue to invest opportunistically in processing, particularly in West Africa. We see that. We see that happening. Is it in expectation of lower raw material prices? That's a question. And we see virtually no promotion of consumption, at least at the generic level. For sure, brands promote their own products. Private label is promoted, but there's virtually no promotion of consumption, not in the way that we see, for example, in almonds, something we've discussed in earlier webinars. So we have a problem, in my opinion. We have a problem of an emerging surplus, which could have significant consequences in the future. What are they, and how can we future-proof the cashew sector? And I'm not going to pretend to have all of the answers to this, far from it. But first we should mention, and again, we're looking back to webinar number 82 last year when we spoke with Hermanut de Bosch of the Fairmatch Support. And we talked about farmers, just to remind ourselves. Typical cashew grower is a small farmer, 1 to 5 hectares. There are around about 5 million farmers, farm families that is, and that is a key factor in influencing the structure of our supply chain. Maybe the key factor in influencing this structure. So the first place we need to look is, how will these farm families be impacted by this market imbalance that has emerged? Well, in time, lower farm gate prices are likely. I mean, whether you set a minimum price or not, look in Côte d'Ivoire today, look right around the sector and see if farm gate prices have kept pace with the rest of the market. Lower farm gates prices obviously mean lower income, reduced incentive to manage the trees, and generally lower quality nuts. And there are little case studies in that. This year, we mentioned the early situation where farmers needed to move a late crop quick so they didn't dry it properly, and we saw an impact then of post-harvest, poor post-harvest practice mentioned in Guinea. That's not science, but it is mentioned by a number of buyers. Secondly, lower farm gate prices, lower income. What does lower income do? It leads to reduced investment. So less inputs, less management of the trees, lower yields. What do farmers do? They need to preserve their income. They have no choice. They plant more trees. If you plant more trees, you get more cashews. If you get more cashews, you get a bigger surplus. So in order to preserve income, we could get more trees. And there's been plenty of examples of that over the past 20 years, especially in West Africa. What happens if that farm, and look, we have got to acknowledge there's no such thing as a cashew farmer, really. They're mostly mixed farmers. Some of them have cashews on the side. Some farmers have more than others, but very few people, with some exceptions in Cambodia, very few people are monoculture cashew farmers. If the farm cannot support the family, you see more migration, you see rural depopulation, you see political unrest, and a reduced ability to manage trees. So what you can see with surplus and lower prices is not an immediate reaction, because these are trees. This is not like an annual crop. These are trees. So they're not going to be cut down because of a few low price years. In actual fact, the opposite has happened in the past. More trees were planted. So what we've seen over the years, when you look at the increase in production year to year, you find that price has very little influence on that. A good year, a bad year, farmers may or may not plant for other reasons. And after a bad year, they may actually plant more trees. Because we try to understand, and I don't pretend to understand, but we try to understand how the smallholder economy works. And it's not on market forces. It's not simply on supply and demand and price. That's for certain. It's far more complex than that. So we may see, despite lower pricing, despite surplus, we may actually see an increase in production. What about the impact on the processors, the roasters? Well, I think what we're going to see, or what we might see, is a kind of a re-commoditization. So sometimes people talk about decommoditization of cashews over the last 20 years, where it became a food ingredient. The operation of the supply chain, at least in kernels, changed. And this supply chain became much more based on building integrated supply chains, more connection to farmers, at least for some people. I think that could be reversed. So I see you get a re-commoditization. So let's say from a supermarket or a roaster's point of view, you get lower prices. Lower prices should increase demand, because unlike farmers, consumers tend to buy more cashews when prices are lower. But the flip side of that is lower quality product